Recording in progress. Great. Fantastic. So, welcome back. This is session four of our reading classic Zionist texts. Um, and we are going to spend a little time today talking about, in particular, what is known as cultural Zionism, which is a little different from some of the approaches that we've read so far. The Zionist we began with really basically religious Zionism. Our earliest readings were basically drawn from people who were very much looking at Zionism from the traditional religious Jewish perspective of it is ultimately our task or our inheritance to return to the land of Israel. And then we took a couple of weeks to talk about the political Zionist movement, with Pinsker, who's talking about auto emancipation, and Herzl, of course, who basically launches the whole enterprise of political Zionism in earnest with the first Zionist Congress in 1897. So the angle today is we're going to be reading from the cultural Zionists. The primary figure here is, of course, Achad Ha'am, and we'll spend probably most of our time with Achad Ha'am. We also have some readings from one of his students, Chaim Nachman Bialik, and I should say a protege, and also Berdichevsky, who's a bit of a contrarian. And if we have some time, we'll get to Berdichevsky at the end. Not as important as a figure, but Achad Ha'am looms large on the Zionist landscape. I'm going to post because the folks who came in didn't get there's the link to the reading in there for those who've just arrived, and you should be able to open that up. And so briefly, before we get started, as my tradition for studying words of our tradition, and I use the term Torah broadly to include, of course, contemporary works as well, including those that we're studying here. This too is Torah, so we should say the bracha together for Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praise to God who has given us this framework of mitzvot through which we might fill our lives with holiness, and in particular the imperative to engage with words of Torah. So that's what we're doing. So what we see as we move into the 1890s and into the early 20th century is this flowering of cultural Zionism, and in particular, as I said, the works of Achad Ha'am. Achad Ha'am is born. His name at birth is Asher Tzvi Ginsburg. He's born in Skvira, Ukraine, which is not far from Kyiv. And Skvira is probably best known for being the home of the Skvira Hasidim, which are a group that at some point immigrated en masse to a town that they established in upstate New York called New Square. New Square, the word square sounding sort of like the Russian Ukrainian name Skvira. But he's born in 1856. He comes from an aristocratic family. He's fairly wealthy, and his family is able to provide him with a good education. They're very pious. They belong to the Hasidic court of Sadagura, which is another Hasidic group. They were so frum that as a kid, he was not allowed to learn even the Russian alphabet, let alone to read Russian literature. But he was truly brilliant, and as a kid, Ginsburg was actually a renowned Talmud scholar. As a teenager, he was known to be a kind of a brilliant scholar. And then, as he is wandering through his teenagerhood, he discovers Maimonides on his own. Now, it's interesting that Maimonides was not something that in this very from Hasidic, this very right-wing Hasidic environment, they allowed him to study, which is interesting. Maimonides, of course, is a rationalist, and the Hasidim have different opinions on some of the aspects of the Jewish bookshelf. But he discovers Maimonides, and then goes from there into the works of the Jewish Jewish Enlightenment of the 19th century. Jewish Enlightenment is a period in which scholarly Jewish people are going to universities, in particular in the German-speaking lands. Moses Mendelssohn is the first of these writers, but there are a bunch of others. Yehuda Leib Gordon, a bunch of others, and so he discovers this work, which was forbidden to him. By the way, he's like reading this like on the down low, and then goes on to secular literature, and then by his early 20s, he's already made this transition where he kind of beginning to reject traditional Judaism. But as we shall see in his writing, he doesn't entirely reject Judaism. He just, as he becomes a Zionist, what he proposes is ultimately a new kind of Jewish existence, and thinks of Israel, the Israel that will be, the theoretical Israel, as being in Hebrew, Merkaz Ruchani, the spiritual center of the Jewish people, that will be a new way of existence, not based in the Torah, let's say, and Torah learning and traditional Judaism, but rather something that incorporates modern learning and understanding, and will create this new sort of Jewish existence. And hence the term cultural Zionism, because he's thinking of the Jewish culture that is going to flourish in this new, at this point, theoretical country. Now, it's not entirely theoretical, because by the 1890s, as he really publishes his first major work in 1889. And at that point, I mean, he's already into his 40s, but he's already, there are, number one, there have been people moving to Israel now for a couple of decades, a very small community, but Zionism has not really caught on so much, to such that people, as some of the earliest Zionist writers have hoped, that they're not all picking up and moving. Again, we're talking about like in the vicinity of couple thousands are moving to then Palestine. But Ginsburg himself becomes affiliated with the group known as Chibat Zion. Sometimes they're referred to as Chovevei Zion, the lovers of Zion, Chibat Zion, the love of Zion, if you will, and particularly following the pogroms of 1881. That is a time that, we've talked about the pogroms of 1881 in Russia, which inspired much of this Zionist work. At a time when the Jews feel that they are under attack, that's a time when they start thinking, oh, might be a good idea to get out of Russia, to get out of Germany, to get out of these places and go to our own country. But he disagrees with some of the other Zionist writers of the time, because they're all about, we have to move now. We have to pick up ourselves, and without too much. As we may have noticed, there hasn't been a lot of detail to these plans. Herzl is the first one in the mid 1890s to really start to flesh out how we might build this new society in Palestine. Ahad Ha'am says, actually, we should probably take our time and think about this a little more carefully. We need to inspire the people here to create this new culture, this new Zionism, which reflects a new Jewish culture, before we all just move to Palestine and set up agricultural collectives. And factories and whatever. Rather, that Zionism has to unfold slowly. And he says the true meaning of Chibat Zion, of this movement, was not to be found as leaders like, actually, this isn't him, this is a commentator. True meaning was not to be found as leaders like Lillian Bloom thought, in mass action, but in the cultural revival and modernization of the Jewish people through the agency of a carefully chosen few. That is to say, there will be these cultural leaders who will ultimately inspire others to create this new synthesis of classical religious faith of the ghetto and contemporary European secular culture and values. And some might say, by the way, even though Ahad Ha'am doesn't turn out to be he's not a great leader. He's not the person who motivates people to pick up and move, which is, you might say, Herzl was better at that, and Chaim Weizmann and some of these other political Zionists who are actually working with governments and so forth. But Ahad Ha'am is really the spiritual advisor to the whole movement. And you might say that what actually is created in the land of Israel is, in fact, that Merkaz Ruchani, that spiritual center, to this day. And what's fascinating about it, for any of us who've been to Israel, what you see is really the whole gamut of Jewish existence, from devoutly secular, like I'm proudly eating a bacon double cheeseburger on Yom Kippur, to people who are, again, theological far right as well, and everything in between. People who actually even reject Zionism and yet still live there, right? That's a reality of a good portion of the Haredi world. So to create this synthesis and this flourishing of the society, Ahad Ha'am actually becomes this kind of Hertzberg, the book from which this is copied, refers to him, as you can see at the top of the pages there on the left, the agnostic rabbi. He is this leader that is not about, we have to do this for God's sake, but we have to do it for our sake as a people, and we have to lead with culture. So he adopts the pen name Ahad Ha'am, that literally means one of the people, because he's kind of diminishing himself, you might say. He's leading quietly from this position of I'm just one of the people. I'm writing in my writing. I'm putting this out there. Just an innocent participant in this whole Zionist environment. He actually turns to writing in earnest because he kind of fails at business. In 1896, they have declining family finances. He takes a job as an editor at a literary journal known as Hashiloach, which becomes a platform for discussion of contemporary problems in Judaism. Resigns in 1902, takes a job working for a tea company, and continues to write. He moves to London in 1907. I mentioned that he was originally from Ukraine, although I think at some point they moved to Odessa. I think they moved to Odessa. I think I might have missed that here. But in any case, moves to London in 1907. He actually makes Aliyah. He moves to Israel in 1921. And he here I just saw that Cindy just came on. I'm reposting the link to the material there. Makes Aliyah in 1921, and he actually lives in Israel until his death in 1927. I'm happy to say that I've seen his gravestone. He's buried with all of the best Zionists who actually ended up living in Tel Aviv, in the Trumpeldor cemetery in central Tel Aviv. So he first uses the pen name in 1889 when he publishes this article, which is called in Hebrew Lo Zu Haderech. This is not the way, and which is an article that's critical of the other political Zionists of the time. But he says we have to flow through culture, not just through brick and mortar, basically. So like I said, he wasn't much of a leader. But he's an advisor to Chaim Weizmann, and helps him when he's lobbying for the Balfour Declaration in 1917. And he has a particular writing style that Hertzberg describes as spare and Western. Remember that the modern Hebrew language is taking place as these guys are. He's one of the earliest to write in Hebrew. I think everybody else that we've read so far wrote in German. German, or maybe we had one. Yeah, I think they're all in German, which was, by the way, the language of culture of the time. Remember, you have Zionists who actually advocate. I think Herzl himself proposed that German be the language of Israel. It's Eliezer ben Yehuda who's living in this crowd as well, who says, no, we are Jews. We have to speak the Jewish language, which is Hebrew. Ahad Ha'am is one of these early Hebrew writers, and he's helping the language take shape. I know I'm spending a lot of time on the introduction. We'll get to the reading in a minute. But what we see with Ahad Ha'am and this cultural Zionist movement is this expansion of the idea of return. Return is not just about picking up and moving. It's also about creating the environment in which that is possible, right? Remember that there's really not much. Yes, there are people living in Palestine, that is true, but there's not much there. There's not a lot of infrastructure. It's hard these early years. Tel Aviv is a new city that's established in 1909. It's literally sand. You go to Tel Aviv and it's hard to believe today, but there's Jaffa, which is an Arab city, and they move a little to the north and they start this new city on sand. There's nothing. According to something that Hertzberg says is that Ahad Ha'am would take a nap in the afternoons when he's an older man by this time, and they shut down his street. That's how small the city is. They were able to shut down his street during Ahad Ha'am's nap time. At his funeral in 1927, says Hertzberg, all of Tel Aviv was there. Now, all of Tel Aviv might have been 700 people. I don't know, but it might be a little bit bigger than that. But in any case, um, so we see this expansion of the idea of return, not just about the nuts and bolts of building a Jewish nation, but more about what the content of that nation should be. And that this Merkaz Ruchani, this idea of the spiritual center, is more complicated than just the physical infrastructure. It's not just about the nuts and bolts. And it makes me think, by the way, and we'll get to it in just another 30 seconds. It makes me think of the sort of the great power of these early Zionist writers. They have to inspire from different directions, right? There have to be the people who are working with the politicians. There have to be people who are speaking to the sort of the traditional aspects of Jewish return, which are all over our texts. Right. But there also have to be people thinking about, yes, this is a new place, and we have to think about what the atmosphere of this place is like. It's a powerful idea that I think, as we've seen with all of this material, is still quite resonant today, even for those of us who are living comfortably in diaspora. So without further ado, let's flip over to, in the reading, page 251, which is, I think, the second page you have there. Need a brave volunteer to read The Law of the Heart from 1894. And this is where he sort of references this idea of who are we, the people of the book, right? By the way, that term, the people of the book, you want to read? People of the book, that's actually, by the way, a term that the Muslim world adopted for the Jews. The original term is Ahl al-Kitab in Arabic. They refer to us as the people of the book, but we wear that badge of honor as a badge of honor. Okay, please go ahead, Kenny.
The relation between a normal people and its literature is one of parallel development and mutual interaction. Literature responds to the demands of life, and life reacts to the guidance of literature. The function of literature is to plant the seed of new ideas and new desires. The seed, once planted, life does the rest.
By the way, of course, I can't read this without thinking about, is that still true today? Is literature still shaping us the way I do not know. We're in a different kind of media environment. But yeah, go ahead. Yes.
The tender shoot is nurtured and brought to maturity by the spontaneous action of men's minds, people's minds, and its growth is shaped by their needs. In time, the new idea of desire becomes an organic part of consciousness, an independent dynamic force, no more related to its literary origin than is the work of a great writer to the primer from which he learned at school.
Keep going.
But a, quote, people of the book, unquote, unlike a normal people, is a slave to the book.
Take a little turn here. Yeah,
good. It has surrendered its whole soul to the written word. The book ceases to become what it should be, a source of ever new inspiration and moral strength. On the contrary, its function in life is to weaken and finally to crush all spontaneity of action and emotion till people become wholly dependent on the written word and incapable of responding to any stimulus in nature or in human life without its permission and approval.
Okay, so what's he doing here? He's actually even speaking biographically, right? I was once a slave to the book. I've set myself free. This is, of course, it's not so subtle. It's a critique of Judaism that, and you will see this as we go on, that our texts have trapped us, and that we are not thinking creatively about them. Kenny, why don't you skip down to the next paragraph? Keep going. We Jews
have been a people of the book in a sense for nearly 2,000 years, but we were not always so. It goes without saying that we were not a people of the book in the era of the prophets, from which we have traveled so far that we can no longer even understand it.
By the way, this is kind of an inversion of Jewish history, I must say. To say that we've been a people of the book, and that we've been that our tradition has been fixed, and we've been slaves to this book for 2,000 years. What happened 2,000 years ago? I mean, it's a little more than, but yeah. Anyway, what happened to that 2,000 years ago? Well, the temple is destroyed in Jerusalem, the year 70. Okay. I mean, he's writing in 1894, so it's more like 1900 years, but whatever. The point is that that's the turning point of Judaism, from the centralization of the temple and the Kohanim and the sacrifices that took place in Jerusalem to portability. To carrying our books with us instead of the centralized hierarchical system. What I see as a rabbi is the flourishing of Jewish tradition after that point, because what was in the temple was fixed. He's saying, we were not subject to the book as much when there was the priestly control and this hierarchical, non-democratic system. Rather, it was like the centralized sacrifices, but people could think and perhaps say whatever they want. Now we're limited to the canon. We're a slave to the canon, is he saying? It's like I said, in my mind, an inversion. Please read a little more.
But even in the period of the Second Temple, heart and mind had not lost their spontaneity of action and their self-reliance. In those days, it was still possible to find the source of the law and the arbiter of the written word in the human heart, as witnessed the famous dictum of Hillel: "Do not unto your neighbor what you would not have him do unto you." That is the whole law.
That's famous, most probably the most famous story in the Talmud about the convert that comes to Shammai and Hillel, and Shammai kicks him. Like he says, "Please convert me to Judaism while I'm standing on one leg." Shammai says, "Get out of here, leave me alone." And Hillel says, "Do not do unto others what is hateful unto you. All the rest is commentary. Now go and learn it." Right? Come and learn. Keep going.
If on occasion the spontaneity of thought and emotion brought them into conflict with the written word, they did not efface themselves in obedience to its dictates. They revolted against it, where it no longer met their needs, and so forced upon it a development in consonance with the new requirements. For example, the biblical law of an eye for an eye was felt by the more developed moral sense of a later age to be savage and unworthy of a civilized nation. And at the time, the moral judgment of the people was still the highest tribunal. Consequently, it was regarded as obvious that the written word, which was also authoritative, must have meant the value of an eye for an eye. That is to say, a penalty in money and not in kind.
Right. So again, what he's saying is that it's once things get fixed in literature, then that's where it starts to go downhill for the Jews. He's going to say, but this state of things did not endure.
But the state of things did not endure. The oral law, which is really the inner law, the law of the moral
And
sense.
just to be clear, oral law refers to Talmud, which is basically a discussion, versus Torah, which is the written law, which is very, very much fixed. We read it the same way as we've read it for literally thousands of years. Go on.
It was itself reduced to writing and fossilized, and the moral sense was left with only one clear and firm conviction, that of its own utter impotence and the eternal subservience to the written word. Conscience no longer had any authority in its own right. Not conscience, but the book became the arbiter in every human question.
Okay, that's probably enough of that, but you get the idea. What's going to happen is he's going to blame the rabbis at first, the rabbis who decided this is how we must read the law, et cetera. And then he actually he backs off from that position. Go over to the next page, 254. He references a work by Gordon that is known as the point of the Yud, but we're not going to get into that. Bottom 254, it says, "Where the natural play of heart and mind is thus stifled." Audrey, would you read next, please?
Where the natural play of heart and mind is thus stifled, we cannot expect to find self-assertion or strength of purpose in any business outside the field of the written word. Logic, experience, common sense, and moral feeling are alike powerless to lead men into paths toward a goal of their own choice. Inevitably, as our experience has shown, this general condition puts obstacles in the way of the solution of any and every one of our problems. It has long been obvious to thinking men that there is no hope for any particular measure of improvement unless the general condition is put right, first of all.
I mean, he says this in very nice, flowery language, but he basically says rabbinic control of Jewish thinking is what's holding us back.
I like this stuff.
Yeah. Thanks. Okay. Go on. The paramount question
Is then whether there is any possibility of curing this long-standing disease, whether the Jewish people can still shake off its inertia, regain direct contact with the actualities of life, and yet remain the Jewish people.
So actually, this is actually the in a nutshell the conundrum of contemporary Judaism. How do we become modern people and still maintain, in some sense, a connection to our past? And of course, there have been many possible responses to that. One answer, by the way, is Zionism, and in fact, the Merkaz Ruchani, this idea of the spiritual center that Achad Am proposes. But other examples of responses to modernity, this conundrum of how do we live in the modern world and still be Jewish, are Reform Judaism and conservative Judaism and Orthodoxy, by the way, which in Orthodoxy is just a response to Reform. Haredi Judaism or Hasidic Judaism and the Misnagdish Judaism, the Lithuanian rejectionists of Hasidism. These are all contemporary responses. Those are all new. Like that's don't think just because people wear a black hat and have side girls or whatever that they're ancient. They're not. No one came down on Mount Sinai looking like that. It's all new. It's all modern. And so too is Zionism a response to modernity, very much based in the same cultural format as all this stuff. And he's speaking of this from the cultural perspective. I'll just skip down to middle of 255, coming into Jewish life from the outside.
Into Jewish life from outside, Haskalah found it easier to create an entirely new mold for its followers than to repair the defects of the Jewish mold while preserving its essential characteristics.
Okay, so just to be clear on what Haskalah is, again, this is the modern movement of that word literally means enlightenment in Hebrew, and there are people who are approaching Judaism from a contemporary perspective in the 19th century, but using the tools of science. At the Jewish Theological Seminary, we occasionally talked about Das Wissenschaft des Judentums, the science of Judaism, which was a particular movement within Haskalah. But again, Reform, conservative orthodoxy, secularism all come out of this Haskalah, this contemporary enlightenment, contemporary education, Jews joining modern civilization, particularly in Europe. Keep reading, if you will. Hence,
there can be no complete answer to our question until a new and compelling urge toward normalization springs up among us from within, from our own Jewish life, and is communicated to the younger generation through education and literature, so that it may fuse with the humanism of Haskalah and prevent the latter from overwhelming and obliterating the Jewish mold.
Right. Humanism does not necessarily collaborate with Judaism, right? Yes, I think as many Jews we want to see humanism in art, but it's a completely different area of philosophy. Please read a little more. You're doing great. A native-born
urge of this kind has recently come into play in the form of the idea which we call Kibbat
Zion, right?
Though that name is inadequate to express the full meaning of the idea. True Kibbat Zion is not merely a part of Judaism, nor is it something added on to Judaism. It is the whole of Judaism.
Okay, that's a bold statement right there. Kibbat Zion, the lovers of Zion, that is all of Judaism, he says. Again, it's like I said, a bold statement, because there's a whole lot of the Jewish world that will disagree with that statement at the time. Go on.
Yep. It neither excludes the written word nor seeks to modify it artificially by addition or subtraction. Mm-hmm. It stands for a Judaism which shall have as its focal point the ideal of our nation's unity, its renaissance, and its free development through the expression of universal human values in the terms of its own distinctive spirit.
So this idea, Chibat Zion, this love of Zion, is actually, he says, it's the focal point of our nation's unity. That is to say that as we move forward through modernity, this sense of unity of peoplehood, which encompasses all these contemporary ideas, is the only way forward, basically. That we need this rebirth that is through love of Zion. One more paragraph.
This is the conception of Judaism on which our education and our literature must be based. We must revitalize the idea of the national renaissance and use every possible means to strengthen its hold and deepen its roots until it becomes an organic element in the Jewish consciousness and an independent dynamic force. Only in that way, as it seems to me, can the Jewish soul be freed from its shackles and regain contact with the broad stream of human life without having to pay for its freedom by the sacrifice of its individuality.
So Jewish nationalism, which of course incorporates the idea of Zionism, must include a sort of re-envisioning of who we are as Jews, and in a contemporary context. Contemporary meaning at this point the end of the 19th century. Now Chad Ha'am, as I mentioned, thank you. Chad Ha'am was at the first Zionist Congress in 1897 in Basel that Herzl had convened, but he didn't go to any others. But he was always, as I said, very involved as a writer, as an advisor. Flip over to page. It doesn't say 261 at the top, but it says 260 on the left side. We'll read this article. He writes to Judah Magnus, who is actually, I believe it says he's based in New York. I think he may have actually been born in America. But Magnus is the person who ultimately establishes the Hebrew University. He's the primary driving force between creating who helps create the Jewish University the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So this is 1910. So we're flipping ahead a little. Next volunteer to read. Somebody want to read?
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Um,
The object of your society.
Oh, okay. The object of your society, you say, is to establish synagogues and houses of study. I am not sure whether you regard the synagogue and the house of study as two distinct institutions and mean to establish them separately from one another. But if you do, I do not think that you will achieve your object. Experience everywhere, and especially in America, has shown that the synagogue by itself as a house of prayer exclusively cannot save Judaism, which, unlike the other religions, does not depend on prayer.
This is painful for me to hear, actually, because I actually think that synagogues are the only way we're going to save Judaism. But I guess I'm biased, right? I work for a synagogue. I kind of live here. But I mean, he wouldn't want me out on the street. He says so. Magnus is saying that synagogues and houses of study. By the way, the two historic Jewish buildings were the synagogue and the Beit Midrash, the synagogue and the house of study. Okay, they were often different places. Modern synagogues basically usually combine the two. As Haram rightly points out, yes, okay, if you study and you don't pray, that's a legitimate Jewish existence. Now those of us who are serious about mitzvot, the commandments of Jewish life, we pray because that's a mitzvah. We are commanded to pray, and we fulfill that commandment by actually engaging in daily prayer. But ultimately, says Haram, what's really important is the study, because we need that knowledge. Keep going, Tom. Yeah.
Numbers.
What do you mean by numbers?
If you have a school and you're studying,
Yes.
you're training children, educating children to participate in the synagogue. So I think what I see him saying, this is the funnel
right
to increase the population.
Okay, that's an interesting point. I think what he's talking about is study of traditional Jewish texts alongside, of course, he wants people to learn modern ideas as well, because that's how we're going to get to this point of the cultural center, the spiritual center. So he thinks that the Beit Midrash is more important because, of course, that's what's going to give us this new cultural landscape. Okay, and of course will lead to, let's say, more children raised in that environment. Yes, the numbers. Keep going, please, Tom.
Nor can the separate house of study, which is intended for young people in search of knowledge, serve as an instrument of popular education. What we have to do is to revert to the system which our ancestors adopted in days gone by, and to which we owe our survival. We have to make the synagogue itself the house of study.
Well, let me just re-emphasize that. We have to make the synagogue itself the house of study. Our altars should be to learning instead of to God. Maybe. All right, okay, keep going.
With Jewish learning as its first concern and prayer as a secondary one. Cut the prayers as short as you like.
Sorry. Keep going, yeah.
Synagogue, a haven of Jewish knowledge, a life for children and adults, for the educated and the ordinary folk. The sermon on Sabbath and the holy days must give the congregants instruction in Torah, not phrases of unctuous piety.
I mean, I don't disagree with it. I mean, Rabbi Akiva in the Talmud says study is greater than action, because study leads to action. Okay, he's not wrong. He's drawing from like a good basis, but the rejection of prayer is hard. I actually think that okay, never mind. Ignore me. Okay, keep going. You're doing great.
But the sermon alone is not enough. The synagogues must be the center to which those who want to learn about Judaism resort every day. Readings on Jewish subjects can be arranged every evening for the more and the less educated separately. That is what our ancestors did with good results. The spirit of the teaching must be different to suit the altered conditions, but the system itself cannot be better.
Okay, and then he goes on to talk about things to study, but he says ultimately learning is the secret of Jewish survival. And again, I think he's standing on firm ground here. I think that I actually think that prayer is important as well. So again, and certainly other people might disagree with him. Yes. That's what a great question. So yes, as you may know, as you surely have noticed, he's always talking about men. You know, all these writers.
What was the question?
The question is there a role for women in all of cultural change, right? Great question. And I I'm certainly not an expert in in what's going on at this time and sort of the intellectual ferment and women's role. I know that in certainly in America this time there are early feminists who are active in when is women's suffrage passed? 1920, is that correct? 1920. So this is this is 10 years before that. So yes, there are certainly voices in the world who are calling for parity between men and women in public life. Now, has that infused the Zionist world? I do not know.
No, for example, Henrietta Zold in 1896, 1 month before Theodore Herzl published The Jewish State, described her vision of a Jewish state in Palestine as a place to ingather diaspora Jewry and revive Jewish culture.
Right, thank you. 1896.
So right, in 1896, according to...
Just in case the folks online didn't hear that, Henrietta Zold, who's an early woman Zionist, it writes, publishes...
Founded Hadassah.
Right, had not yet founded Hadassah, writes an article that says that, how did you put it? That women need to play a role in this, basically. And more or less, she's ignored. More or less. So yes, I don't know that it's on their radar. What's interesting, of course, about when the state of Israel is established, of course, is that women, well, okay. I don't want to. I'm not an expert in feminist history, but I do know that that women served in the Israeli army long before they served in many other armies. Israel had a female head of state long before many countries. Of course, we've never even had one here in America. That women's roles in the kibbutz were the way that the kibbutzim were arranged were much again, I don't want to say exactly egalitarian, but certainly were ahead of their time. Let's leave it at that. But this is not an area which I have a lot of expertise. But yes, we don't hear women's voices in these texts. The fact that Hertzberg, I think that whole book, I didn't bring the book, but I don't know that there's a single female author in the Zionist idea.
Troy includes some women's voices in his updated version of
Hertzberg's, good to know. Yes.
Called the Zionist idea.
Yes, right, good. Thank you. So yes, so there may have been a few women writers, again, Hertzberg who publishes that. I think that's from the 1960s, maybe. So he probably did not include them at that time. But good question. Let's let. Okay, I'm conscious of the time here, and I wanna. I'm sorry. We're not gonna. I don't know if we can read more Achad Ha'am. I mean, he goes on to critique. I encourage you to take these home and read them. It's fascinating reading. He criticizes Judaism in many ways. He actually differentiates between Judaism of the East. There's a different problem in Eastern Europe versus Western Europe. And of course, by the way, none of these writers also are accounting for the other half of the Jewish world, which by the lives in in the Middle East and North Africa. Right? You don't hear voices from what were they saying in Iran about Zionism? We don't know because they were also not included, or Iraq, where there are huge communities, or Morocco. So also an interesting factor here. Zionism, it is true, is a kind of a European endeavor for now, anyway. That'll change more or less in 1948. Okay, so yes, he talks about the different challenges of the different Jews and where they are. I think it's nice to read. Hold on, there's one part that I marked here. So, actually, go over to page 273. Let's just read this paragraph here. Page 273, and then we'll go on to Bialik. where it says a complete national life involves two things. Again, this is part of his vision of the Merkaz Ruchani, the spiritual center. Another volunteer to read? Joe, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Before I read, I'm going to tell you, this is Mexico.
Oh, of course.
It went on for decades. It went on for decades.
Still going on.
It really didn't really, get traction until the Holocaust. Holocaust changed everything.
Absolutely.
So while we're reading this, we should think about the current situation where Israel is extremely divided. And I don't know about, I'm sure the rest of the people in this room every day, in particular for me, when I get up in the morning, I wonder, what else can I come up with to solve the problem or to help solve the problem? And that's why we're reading this now. That should be the main reason why.
Joe, I like you. Yes, check is in the mail. Thank you for calling attention to the fact that in rereading these texts, I'm hearing a lot of things that we're still seeing in our world today, and I think that's a huge part of this. So thank you. Okay, please read.
Complete national life.
Yeah, 273. Yep.
Involves two things. First, full play for the creative faculties of the nation in a specific national culture of its own. And second, a system of education whereby the individual members of the nation will be thoroughly imbued with their culture and so molded by it that its imprint will be recognizable in all of their ways of life and thought, individual and social. These two aspects of a national life may not always be realized in the same degree, but broadly speaking, they are interdependent. If the individuals are not imbued with the national culture, the development of the nation will be arrested, and its creative faculties will suffer atrophy or dissipation. On the other hand, if those faculties are not sufficiently employed in the service of the development of the national culture, the education of children and adults alike will become narrow. Its influence will progressively decline, and many individuals will turn elsewhere for the satisfaction of their cultural needs, with the result that gradually their minds and characters will cease to be to bear the nation's influence.
Right. So what he's saying is that creating a culture is complicated. That's what they're effectively doing. I don't know that this has ever been tried anywhere else. How do you create a new culture? Cultures happen organically. They aren't artificially created. And you have to create institutions. You have to have the Batei Midrash, the houses of study where people learn this is our culture and they pass it on. Now, some aspects of you might say, and again, I'm looking at the present backward now. Some of these things succeeded and some failed, right? The revival of the Hebrew language succeeded. I mean, is it still filled with lots of foreign words? Yes. You know what the success rate of the Hebrew Language Academy is in creating new words? Like they create new words, and it's like 18% of the words they make are actually adopted in common use. Some of you know modern Hebrew know that like there are occasionally new words, but most of the time they just borrow an English word. One of the most ubiquitous inventions of our time, the computer, became in some languages. In Japanese, I think they say something that sounds like computer. In Hebrew, they actually created a word with the word from the word to think, a lachshov. They created the word machshev, a thinking tool. It's got the form of a tool and it thinks. They're gonna come up with something new for artificial intelligence. They're probably just calling it AI. But in any case, the idea that of creating a new culture is complicated because if people don't buy into it, what happens? It sort of makes a big mess, And you might say, by the way, that is you can see the results of that mess, that failure in certain aspects to get everybody on board with the program because you can't do that. It's actually even, I mean, and Haram acknowledges that. Okay, I'm sorry, we got to move on because I just want to get to a little Bialik. Okay, another story. I don't want to get dragged into America right now. Yeah, sure, we're already here. Okay, so Chaim Nachman Bialik is born in 1873 in a village near Zhytomyr. It's one of those places that we've heard of in recent times because of the war in Ukraine. Poor family. His father died when he was 7. Mother struggled to support the family, and he's sent to live with his very pious grandfather. So all of these guys, they seem to have a similar story. Many of them grew up in a very, very pious environment in which they're steeped in Jewish text. They're able to make this transition to Zionism because they begin to think critically about what they learn as a child. So Bialik learns Jewish texts, but he also eventually discovers the Haskalah literature. He goes in 1890 at age 17 to go study at the famous yeshiva at Volozhin, which is one of the most important yeshivot in Eastern Europe. Joins Chibat Zion and there at the yeshiva of Volozhin, it's like a secret society, right? So he joins this group of Zionists. He's there for about 18 months, but then he leaves. He's had enough of the yeshiva. Goes to Odessa and he meets Ahad and becomes his protege. Because, by the way, all the best intellectuals of the time are in Odessa. Odessa is the place you go when you want to be within the intellectual ferment of the Jewish world in the late 19th century. He marries the daughter of a lumber merchant, but he tries and he fails at business. And none of these guys are good businessmen. Becomes a Hebrew teacher in 1897. He moves to teach in Hebrew in a Polish town, but he's even worse at that, apparently, than business. By the way, a Hebrew teacher, interesting to point out that he's part of this movement where they're trying to teach Hebrew. I'm always amazed when I meet, there are like people I've known in my life, Holocaust survivors who learned Hebrew before the war. They weren't in Israel, they were in Eastern Europe, but they learned Hebrew because Hebrew was being taught, spoken Hebrew. As part, and that's actually part of Ahad Am's vision. He succeeds in some sense in these folks succeeded actually creating this idea that if we want to move forward as a people, whether we're in Israel or not, we have to learn the language of the Jews. I'm sorry to say that we've lost a lot of that. Our kids are not learning Hebrew today, certainly the way they used to. But he's a writer, a publisher, and an editor. He's ultimately becomes known for Bialik becomes one of the greatest, if not the greatest, Hebrew poet. His poem Ba'ir HaHarega, in the City of Slaughter, is written after the Kishinev pogrom in 1903. And it is a poem that to this day I think children in Israel still learn in the Israeli school system. But it is a seminal work that is a Zionist work. It concludes by saying, the text here, the last stanza begins, Ve'ata ma lecha po ben adam kum barach hamidbara. And now you, what are you doing here, ben adam? Son of man is how the Christians translate that, but you young person, get up and flee to the desert. Flee to the desert. The lesson of the pogroms is there's no future for you here. You got to move. Okay, that's 1903. He's a big supporter of the Hebrew University. He does make Aliyah in 1924. His house today is a museum. I've actually been to Beit Bialik. It's an open museum. Some of you have probably also been there. He speaks at the founding of the Hebrew University in 1925. So we're gonna read a little of that now. Volunteer to read. Who's reading next? Page 280. Sorry, yes, 281. Read. So on page 281, down about more than 3/4 of the way down, where I put a little mark there. At this moment, Israel has kindled. See that? Mm-hmm.
Here. Okay, that's fine. At this moment, Israel has kindled upon Mount Scopus the first candle of the Renaissance of her intellectual life.
They love this word Renaissance, to rebirth, right? Okay, and no, that's 40 years later. 1925. We're in 1925, the establishment of the Hebrew University. Keep going. That's on Mount Scopus. That's a mountain in Jerusalem. Go on.
This day, the glad tidings will come unto all the scattered families of Israel, wherever they may be, that the first peg in the upbuilding of the higher Jerusalem.
Yerushalayim Shalmala, the Jerusalem on high. We're building not only Jerusalem down here on the ground, we're also building Yerushalayim Shalmala. Yeah, keep going.
Has been fixed for all time. We let people say that they may, this peculiar people called Israel, as despite all the
vicissitudes
3,000 years, and daily yet hourly attempted to expel it from its own milieu and uprooted from the spiritual climate. This people, I assert, has accepted upon its body and soul the burden of eternal allegiance to the kingdom of spirit. Within the kingdom, it recognizes itself as a creative citizen. And in that eternal soil, it has planted its feet with all its might.
This is gorgeous writing. The kingdom of the spirit. He's using, of course, the language of his teacher Achad Ha'am, right? We are building right here on the ground and in Jerusalem on high this kingdom of the spirit because that's who we are, the Jews. Keep going a little bit. The
accused Galut.
The accursed galut. That's us. That's the diaspora, right? All the sordidness of the accursed galut, the dispersion of the Jews.
And all the pain of our people's poverty did not disfigure its fundamental nature. Obligated to sacrifice temporal life for eternal life, it learned in the days of suffering and travail to subordinate material to spiritual needs and the requirements of the body to those of the soul. Within the boundaries of the realm of the spirit of the Jewish nation, fashioned the basics of the national heritage and its principal national institutions. These preserved it through millennia of wandering, safeguarded its inner freedom amid outward bondage, and have led up to this joyful event of the inauguration of the university on Mount Stone.
Oh, that's okay. So what he's actually doing, by the way, this is a great Jewish tradition. Okay, the rabbinic enterprise in the 2nd century writes a history of itself. At the beginning, it's the first Mishnah of the first chapter of Pirkei Avot, which is part of the Mishnah, where it says Moses got the Torah on Mount Sinai and gave it to the prophets who gave it to the elders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and down to us. And we're carrying Torah forward. And what is Bialik doing here? By the way, he is the actress Mayim Bialik. She has actually a relative of Chaim Nachman Bialik. So there's still Bialiks running around in this world. But in any case, what is Bialik saying? All of that history of Jewish learning, which has come down through us, through the Beit Midrash, through the houses of study that we maintained, the yeshiva, the cheder, all places we've continued to learn, and it's come to its fruition at this moment where we're building the Hebrew University. By the way, it's not the Jewish university; it's the Hebrew university. Okay, they're leaning into the language has the spirit, right? Judaism suggests, the old Jew in the ghetto, but now we are the new Jew. We are Hebrews. Sounds funny, right? Because I think of Hebrews as like the Hebrews that the Egyptians enslaved. But yes, no, that they really when Ben Yehuda was his phrase, his slogan was Ivri daber Ivrit, Hebrew, speak Hebrew. That's an imperative. You Hebrew, you should speak Hebrew. You are a Hebrew. I guess I hope you all know that. We're all Hebrews. In any case, all right, move on. Another volunteer to pick up the bottom on 283, where it says, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, we're mentioning the ladies here for a change. Okay, yes, briefly. Sabina, why don't you read, ladies and gentlemen?
What has become of our old spiritual strongholds in the diaspora in recent times, and I need not dwell upon this theme now. For all their inner strength and for all the energy the nation has expended upon creating and preserving these centers, they stood not firm on the day of wrath. By the decree of history, they are crumbled and razed to the foundations. And our people is left standing empty-handed upon their ruins. This is the very curse of Galut, that our undertakings do not, indeed cannot prosper.
Yes, right, keep going. Yep.
We have been sowing a bushel and reaping less than a peck.
The
winds and hurricanes of history always begin by attacking the creation of Israel, and in a moment uproot and utterly destroy that which hands and minds have produced over a period of generations. Through cruel and bitter trials and tribulations, through blasted hopes and despair of the soul, through innumerable humiliations, we have slowly arrived at the realization that without a tangible homeland, without private national premises that are entirely ours, we can have no sort of a life, either material or spiritual. Without Eretz Yisrael, Eretz means land, literally land. There is no hope for the rehabilitation of Israel anywhere, ever.
So basically, everything that the Jews have done in diaspora, says Bialik, has come to naught. The only way that we can be fully ourselves is for us to be in our own land, he says. That all that work, the very curse of the Galut, is that no matter what we build, it will be torn down by those who will not allow us to achieve our full fruition. Again, like for us who are living in diaspora today, okay, we're all still here, right? I mean, this is it's a little insulting. There's still a very strong element of this in Israeli society to this day. Why do you think was it Naftali Bennett who came the Shabbat after the shooting here, who spoke at Beth Shalom? It was Naftali Bennett, wasn't it?
Soldiers and sailors.
No, here at Beth Shalom, the Shabbat after the week after the shooting. No, it wasn't Herzog. I think it was Naftali Bennett. In any case, and why was he there? Why was it important for an Israeli politician to show up and speak in Pittsburgh? Because it was from his perspective and the perspective of many Israelis. And by the way, I get this from my son all the time. Diaspora is over. Come home. He didn't say that, but that was definitely implicit in his message. And by the way, again, it's horrible. Yeah, he would never say this out loud. I'm mindful of the fact that we are a community of survivors, having survived that shooting. But the lesson throughout Jewish history that he reinforced at that moment was that you will always be subject to this in diaspora, and the only way that we can that we can live fully as Jews is to come home to Eretz Yisrael. Okay, not saying that I agree with that entirely, although it is certainly a valid point in Jewish world and certainly a part of our of contemporary Judaism, an idea that's out there. Okay, with that, let's just read one little bit about by Berdichevsky to just get a sense of sort of the range of cultural Zionism. Berdichevsky is really a critic. It's interesting that Hertzberg includes him because he basically has one message, which is that he loves Jewish tradition, and yet he understands that it is not the future. Okay, he loves a Talmud Torah, but he also really feels like we have to change Judaism in order for it to be to create this Merkaz Ruchani, this spiritual center. Just briefly, his dates are 1865 to 1921. He's born in Russia. He goes to study at University of Breslau, although he also comes from a yeshiva background. He studies at Volozhin as well. White writes in many languages: Hebrew, Yiddish, German. Writes a dissertation on the relationship of ethics and aesthetics. He is very prolific. He has 20 collected volumes in Hebrew, which is much more than any of our previous writers. But he basically says his fundamental message in Berdichevsky's writings is there is no way to successfully bridge the gap between old and new, between classical Judaism and contemporary values, and yet they're still both important for us as we move forward as Jews. So just to read something from him, Wrecking and Building on page, this is page 293. I'll read this one. So 293, it says Wrecking and Building. I know the number's not at the top. You can see the 292. After the destruction of the temple, our political status declined. Remember, that's 2,000 years ago. Our political status declined and our independence came to an end. We ceased to be a people actively adding to its spiritual and material store and living in unbroken continuity with its earlier days. As our creativity diminished, the past, whatever had once been done and said among us, our legacy of thoughts and deeds became the center of our existence, the main supports of our life. The Jews became secondary to Judaism. All sentiments of survival, all vital desires that had swelled the hearts of Jacob's children in former times, sought an outlet through these channels. Many thought that they could satisfy the national conscience that lived in their hearts by preserving what had been handed down from their ancestors. Turn over the page. Apart from turning into spiritual slaves, men whose natural forces had dried up and whose relation to life and to the world was no longer normal, this brought about the great interruption in our social and political development, an interruption that has almost led to total decay. Okay, so again, you can see like he's quite critical of Judaism historically. Skip over to 295. Here's the solution. We must cease to be tablets on which books are transcribed and thoughts handed down to us, always handed down. Through a basic revision of the very foundation of Israel's inner and outer life, our whole consciousness, our predispositions, thoughts, feelings, desires, and will and aim will be transformed, and we shall live and stand fast. Such a fundamental revision in the people's condition, the basic drive toward freedom, and the boundless urge to new life will revive our souls. Transvaluation, he borrows this term, by the way, from Nietzsche. Nietzsche talks about transvaluation, which is reevaluation of our values based on rejecting the standards of the past. Okay, transvaluation is like a flowing spring. It revives whatever is in us, in the secret places of the soul. Our powers are filled with a new, life-giving content. Such a choice promises us a noble future. The alternative is to remain a straying people following its erring shepherds. A great responsibility rests upon us, for everything lies in our hands. We are the last Jews, or we are the first of a new nation. So with that, there's a little Berdichevsky for you. With that, I'm going to say that our next session, I hope you all enjoyed all this material. It's great stuff. I strongly encourage you to read the rest of it. It's great. And the next session is on, write this down somewhere here, April 1st. April 1st, that's a Tuesday. We'll be studying, I haven't prepared these yet. I wrote down 5 names in the next in the next round. We're getting into, like, now at this point, the teens and the 20s. Harav Kook, Rabbi Kook, who's the first chief rabbi of Mandate Palestine. Yehuda Magnus, who we encountered earlier. Martin Buber, of course. Solomon Schechter, Louis Brandeis. They are in sort of the next tranche of Zionists, so we'll talk about them next time. Sorry, no time for questions, but you can always contact me and ask a follow-up. And we're gonna say Kaddish Rabbanan. Let me share my screen here for folks online. And if you want to, if those of us in the room, I actually remember to put out the books this time. Where is it? Let's try this. Share, and it's over here. Okay, you should be able to see the Kaddish Rabbanan there. Please rise and recite with me. Again, this is a prayer that we say at the conclusion of a period of study. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah be'alama tivrach hirutei v'yamlich malchutei b'chayechon u'v'yomechon u'v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael ba'agala u'v'zman kariv v'imru amen. Yehi shemei Rabbah mevarach le'alam u'lalamei alamaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemer kudsha b'rechum le'ella min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata da'amiran be'alama v'imru amen.
Amen.
Al Yisrael ve'al Rabbanan ve'al Tamidehon ve'al kol talmidei Tamidehon ve'al kol man de'asakin be'oraita di ve'atra hadein v'di ve'chol atar v'atar yehe lahon ulchon shel amaraba china v'chisda v'rachamin v'chayin narichin umzona revicha u'forkana min kodam mavon nivishmaya v'imru amen.
Amen.
Shlama Rabba min Shemaya v'chaim tovim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'ruma u'brachama v'yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru
Amen.
Thank you all very much for learning with me today. Next session is our last. And of course, all these, if you've missed any of the sessions, they're all online on the, you can find them on the Lunch and Learn page on the Beth Shalom website. You can watch the videos and reread the materials. And I will see you all soon. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Good to see you online.
The materials are.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're online. Let's hold on. See you all soon.
Bye-bye.
The materials online. All of the videos are there, and the text is in a link with the video as well, so you can find it. It's all there.
Do you happen to have?
If you want, I have extra copies. You want copies? Yeah, come to my office. Come to my office right now.
Thank you.
See you.